house lovers. I thought, following my last video, that I might do something a little more specific about the history of this house, how I went about finding it, because I realise it's not that easy and you all might have the same questions. So I thought I'd start from the very beginning and go through each process that I went through to find the history of the house, which I found really exciting and interesting. You've bought yourself your dream home. You're filled with excitement. It's an interesting place. Clearly, it has a history. And really, any building's got a history. Whether it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, things could have happened. There is lots to find out about it. Let's go to the beginning. The first thing that you can do is talk to the real estate agent. So when we bought this house, the vendor's mother had bought it in the 1950s, and she had come from Slovenia to Australia. We also found out that her name, the mother, was called Frances. And on the pediment above the house was the name Frances painted in blue a few years ago. So if I Google mapped, street viewed the house, it still had that vision of Frances' house in the pediment box at the top, where the old name used to be. It has since been whitewashed out. So that revealed that. So there you go, first part of history. Ask the vendors if they have any family photographs that may be around for the last few generations. So you'll get a sense of what the house may have looked like 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, if you're very lucky. Alas, we didn't. No photographs to be seen. Just this one that I found from a heritage archive, which is from the 80s, and it was the only picture of the facade that I could find. It showed the plane trees out the front had been really severely pruned, and I can see that in 30 odd years they've grown well. And then obviously the other thing you can do is ask some of your neighbours if they've been around for a while. You might find someone who's lived here for their whole life. Often great sources of information.
One of the benefits of asking some questions of the vendor and of the real estate agent was that they mentioned that the ceilings had been replaced or lowered. So we kind of thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe the ceilings are in fact, 30 centimetres higher than they are. So when we had some experts come and look through the place, what we actually discovered was that they hadn't been lowered. That the old ceilings were obviously in a bad condition, so new plasterboard was stuck up, which meant all the ceiling roses had been replaced. The other little bit of interesting information that I found out was through Trove was the licensing history of the pub next door and how this house had been connected to it as accommodation. So we're able to find out proof of that in the record, and then having a look at the structure of the house, we could actually see the shadows of those old doors in the wall. Now I just find that interesting. I mean, it doesn't make any difference, but it all adds to the picture of the building in your mind. You get a sense of what's happened here and who's lived here. I just found it very interesting.
So there you go. You've asked your neighbours, you've asked the real estate agent, you found out some basic stuff. The next thing is you want details and nitty gritty. So of course, Google is your friend. However, it's not that simple. And really not a lot came up. You get a lot of real estate listings, but nothing of great interest. So after getting nowhere with Google and doing I thought some quite nifty little searches, I just kind of gave up. It was really difficult. So I went to my local library and said, I need some pointers into how to investigate the history of the building that I've just bought. The librarian there didn't really have much insight, but he put me in touch with someone who was sort of an amateur historical sleuth. So I made an appointment and I went to go and meet Heather in North Melbourne Library. And I guess the thing to remember is you're kind of on an archaeological investigation yourself. It's a bit of a detective work. So one little clue might lead to another. So you're kind of not going to get it all in one location. You've got to be patient and kind of work your way laterally through the little bits of information that you get. So I went to go and meet Heather at the North Melbourne Library, and she just knew her way around the highly Machiavellian and labyrinthine archives. And what she said, the first thing you need to do is try and find the rates history of the property. So what that meant was finding the ward that the building sat in, and then finding the street address in the rates books, and then tracing them back through the volumes, through the years, until you find the first entry. Now, in a new country like Australia, not that difficult, so we're able to find the street, a ward district, and volume, and then we were able to begin the process. We didn't know what year the house was built, so we kind of didn't know. We were stabbing in the dark, 1880, 1860. So we just started around that because that's what the house looked like in terms of its period, and off we went. So through a series of deductions, we were able to get to the first entry, which was in 1874. So we then knew the year that the house first appeared in the rates history, and then we could make a fairly good assumption that that was the year that it was built. And the next thing that Heather the librarian was able to show me was a plan of the subdivision for this part of Melbourne, and that revealed who had been allocated each bit of land. And how do I know that? I'll tell you in a minute. Okay, so you've gone to your local council's archive, you have found the historic rates records, which gives you the name of the person who is the owner of the house and perhaps who is the occupant, which might not be the same thing. So you've got some names. Now those names you can then use, depending on which period you're in. You can look at the census records for that period and find out some more information about the other people living in the house, because that can reveal a bit more. It can reveal whether the house was a private dwelling, whether there were domestic staff, whether it was a boarding house, whatever it was. So the names that you find in the rates can often lead you to the census report. You could also start with the census, so it just depends what might be easier. I guess the big mystery for this house, though, was that the name had been chiselled off. And that was kind of curious. So often with these houses from this period, the stucco falls off a little bit, but there's always a little bit of the name left. But ours has quite clearly been totally obliterated. And then at some point in the 70s, one of the owners wrote her name, very badly, bless her, in the pediment. I was kind of curious to try and find out what the name was. That was a little tricky. Luckily for us, the building next door used to be a pub. So what we had to find was the name of the pub. Finding the name of the pub or another landmark, we could then work backwards and see if there's any information we could find out about the street, the area, and whether or not the other buildings were mentioned. How did we find the name of the pub? Sewage. In a nutshell, sewage. So what we managed to find was an old sewage plan in the archive of Melbourne City Council, and that showed an early plan for bringing in main sewers to this area. And what it did, it listed all the buildings in the area. So it listed which ones were pubs, which ones were houses. There's a school further up the road, and it gave the name. So it gave the name of the pub next to us, which was called the Royal Standard. Melbourne's sewage history revealed all. It's like sifting through stools to find out what someone's eaten. So what to do next? Heather, the brilliant librarian, revealed to me that there is an organisation in Australia called Trove, and I think it's trove.gov.org.au, something anyway. If you Google Trove, I'll actually show you here. It is the online digital archive of every printed bit of matter in Australia, from magazines, newspapers, advertisements. So we had the name of the pub, and what Heather pointed out, there tends to be a few news stories based around pubs because things go on. Fights, a licensing application, naughty goings on. So because we had the name of the pub from the sewage plan, we were able to then go to Trove. And then from Trove, I was able to search in Victoria and search for that name, Royal Standard Hotel, Melbourne. We had the year the house was built, 1874. Bing! Search, and off we went. Quite a few things turned up. Someone died next door. It was a man or woman anyway. Someone died in their bath. No blame was attached to the significant other. What it did miraculously reveal to us is that this house, the neighbouring property, was called Bonaccord because it crops up in many news stories, largely because the house had been used as accommodation for the pub next door, and because there'd been a few nefarious goings on. Some people had been selling liquor illegally on Sundays, and basically it had been run as a brothel. One of the interesting things I found out about this street is that it was involved in a notorious gangland chasing and killing, really, of a guy called Squizzy Taylor in the 1920s, who was a notorious Melbourne gangster, apprehended by the police on Barclay Street, just across the road from us, chased through a back lane. So that was kind of interesting as well, to find out that he was in this hood in the 1920s. So there we are, house lovers. That's how I went about researching the history of the house. So I have to say, it wasn't all me. I actually was very lucky to have the benefit of some insightful experts through the library system.
And I think actually most people will need that because it's pretty difficult to try and find out exactly what you're looking for. It's not just a question of Googling and searching. There are some very odd processes that you have to go through and some knowledge that you need to be able to access the information. So I would say make friends with a librarian, be very nice, don't take up too much of their time. I mean, the other option is you can just pay someone a fortune to archaeologically investigate the history of your house, which people do, and that's fantastic, but I didn't really have the money for that and kind of interested in doing it myself. So just to recap, the first thing we did was ask questions of the vendor, neighbours and anyone associated with the house. The next thing we did was do general Googling to try and find some images. The next thing we did was ask a friend, and we were able to find the rates history for this area, which then revealed some names, some dates and the build date of the house. We then used that to look at a sewage map, which revealed the name of the pub next door. Using the name of that landmark, we were able to research and find some stories written about this area and some goings on that had happened, including revealing the name of the house, which was absolutely fantastic, like striking gold. So we were very, very happy with that. And the other important thing to remember, very important thing to remember, is that Australia is a First Nation. So there were people here before the European settlement. Carlton was subdivided in about 1851, but the area that is now known as Melbourne was traditionally the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to say thank you to them. Thank you for their stewardship of this amazing bit of Melbourne and Victoria, and we are going to do our best to preserve this little bit and turn it into something beautiful and sustainable and green and water retaining and climate sensitive, and look after this little bit in perpetuity for the generations to come. So thank you to the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation who lived here first. There we are, house lovers. I hope you have loved your How to Research the History of My House 101. It's been a pleasure. I know you're desperate for more, so I'm going to urge you to subscribe and leave a comment if there's anything you want to know more about what I've been doing and how I've been going about it with this house project. So, house lovers, until next time,